Seymour Rocks reporting from Down Under. Apart from the veritable elephant in the room, I can't think of anything more important at this moment in Australia or New Zealand than this story that happened yesterday. And I'd just like to start with a quote from Pastor Niemoller. First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. I think this is a slight misquote because the version that I know starts off, first they came for the communists. Anyway, I think that this needs a paraphrasing to reflect conditions now, but I'm not the one to provide that, so I won't even try. So this is the story from yesterday from the ABC. ABC raid, Australian Federal Police leave Ultimo buildings with files after hours-long raid over Afghan file stories. Australian Federal Police officers have left the ABC's Sydney headquarters more than 8 hours after a raid began after a series of 2017 stories known as the Afghan Files. The stories by ABC investigative journalists Dan Oakes and Sam Clark revealed allegations of unlawful killings and misconduct by Australian Special Forces in Afghanistan and were based off hundreds of pages of secret defence documents leaked to the ABC. The search warrant named Oakes, Clark and the ABC Director of News, Gavin Morris. The AFP officers took with them 2 USB drives containing a small number of electronic files, which were sealed in plastic bags pending a review by ABC lawyers. So I will just start off. It took many hours for this to appear on Radio New Zealand, but they finally did a piece this morning, which I will play, and then you can make up your mind about the coverage.
Now, Australia's national broadcaster, the ABC, is describing a police raid on its Sydney headquarters yesterday as bad, sad and dangerous. The broadcaster's head of investigative journalism, John Lyons, made the assessment as he live tweeted while federal police searched ABC computers for material related to a 2017 investigative series, The Afghan Files. The stories revealed allegations of unlawful killings and misconduct by Australian Special Forces in Afghanistan based on hundreds of pages of secret defence documents leaked to reporters. The ABC's editorial director is Craig McMurtry. He joins us now. Good morning.
Good morning.
Was this
orders shortly beforehand, but as you would imagine, it is not an everyday occurrence for Australian Federal Police to show up at the headquarters of the national public broadcaster in Australia with a search warrant.
How long were they there? What did they take away?
So they were there for about 9 hours yesterday. It was a long time. They went through many things. They went through electronic messages, files, records, reports, scripts, thousands and thousands of files, which was what was so disconcerting. At the end of the 9 hours, after spending some time with our lawyers, they left with a couple of USBs with a few electronic files. Now, these files are sealed, and our lawyers have another 2 weeks to see if there are further legal grounds that may prevent the release of those documents.
What's at stake here? I mean, could journalists be charged here? What's at stake?
Well, so we're concerned, obviously, about the chilling effect it has on the freedom of the press. Whether or not charges follow is a matter for the federal police. We believe that we have acted lawfully at all times. We absolutely stand by our colleagues and their reporting. It was outstanding reporting from a couple of years ago. And, of course, the Director of News of the ABC, Gavin Morrison, is also named in the warrant. But the other matter is, I guess that we should mention, is the whistleblowers. So our journalists, of course, have the support of the national public broadcaster behind them. But the other reason that this is so concerning, and not what you expect in democracies like New Zealand or Australia, is the message this sends to people who don't have that kind of support, people who are legitimate sources or whistleblowers out there who want to reveal things that are definitely in the public interest to report, that governments might find to be difficult or challenging, but clearly they are in the public interest to report.
For some, though, who may argue classified information, defence, security, the protection of Australia, I'm sure there are some in Australia who are arguing that this sort of classified material has to be protected.
Sure, and I don't know that this is an argument about that necessarily, but just as, I started reporting in New Zealand. I know that there's a vigorous press in New Zealand. It's fundamental to a functioning democracy. That is true here as well. And it's not as though we are cavalier about these things. We have exhaustive quality control and checking processes, and we always strive to act in the public interest. And it is our job as journalists to hold government and authorities and agencies to account. And that is why this is so important.
And how worrying is it that this comes the day after a News Corp journalist was also raided over a story concerning mass surveillance, two in quick succession? Has that really rocked the media in Australia?
Yes, it has. Now, the authorities have been clear in saying that these two things are unrelated, but the timing is at best unfortunate, and it has raised eyebrows and questions here. And just like I'm talking to you now, there have been interviews, and it's been noticed in other parts of the world as well. It's just not what we expect when we think about, a vigorous democracy in Australia. It's the symbolism of it, I guess, that is so concerning. It shouldn't be normalised. It should feel uncomfortable, and it certainly does.
What's the government saying, the newly elected government?
Well, the Prime Minister is, of course, in London at present, and he has said that he supports freedom of the press, and he has said that the federal police acted independently of the government, that this certainly didn't happen at the behest of a government minister, essentially that's been his message so far.
Is it fair to say that the ABC has a frosty relationship at times with the coalition government?
Well, we have a frosty relationship at times with any government of the day when we publish material that they find very confronting and would prefer was not published, whether it's coalition or Labor. Yeah, when you're a national public broadcaster, just like RNZ, sometimes when you report things that the government of the day really wished you wouldn't, relations are a bit frosty.
Indeed. Now, what happens next? What can you do now to protect your sources, your media, your journalists, that sort of thing?
So we will continue to defend our position. As I mentioned earlier, our lawyers will now go through the documents. And even though the AFP went through thousands of files, there are only a few documents that have actually left the building and they are sealed. Our lawyers will now spend some time, up to a couple of weeks, seeing if there are any further legal grounds that would prevent their release. And that's what our focus will be on, as well as supporting our journalists, of course, who did some outstanding work 2 years ago. That's the other thing that's extraordinary about this. The reporting is actually it was very important at the time, of course, but the reporting is now nearly 2 years old.
And what sort of public support are you seeing? Is there a debate in the public now being fired up?
Yeah, absolutely there is. Media groups have come forward, other press organisations. It's fair to say, for example, that we don't often align with News Corp publicly on issues, but just as their journalist, the home of their journalist was raided yesterday, we are completely aligned on this issue. It has definitely caused concern over here. And has led to an active debate and will certainly, I imagine, be picked up by politicians of all persuasions in the days ahead.
That is the ABC's editorial director, Craig McMurtry. Thank you very much for your...
A couple of photographs of the federal police with the ABC's lawyers. And not sure what his position in ABC, head of news or something. John Lyons was at this, and he was able to tweet on this as it was going. But the most important tweet that perhaps I saw was this one. Australian Federal Police. I'm still staggered by the power of this warrant. It allows the Australian Federal Police to, quote, add, copy, delete or alter material in the ABC's computers. All Australians, please think about that. As of this moment, the AFP has the power to delete material in the ABC's computer. This is Australia in 2019. Quite. And I couldn't say it any better than that. And Caitlin Johnston has produced a really good article. I'm not going to read it, but I'm going to leave the link down below, and I hope that you will read it. In the meantime, I am just going to pass on this quote from the other great, well, not the other, Australia's foremost journalist, John Pilcher, on this, and the reason why he thinks actually the Assange case is so important.
Thank you.
You've said Julian Assange's arrest is a warning from history. Who should be worried?
Journalists should be worried, first of all. This is part of a campaign against journalists, but particularly against the public's right to know. I mean, it's saying that if we as journalists publish something that governments really don't like, especially their secrets, they can lock us up for life. Certainly that would be true in the case of Assange. And if we try to protect our sources, they'll come after us, as in the case of Chelsea Manning.
Coverage describes this as having a chilling effect on journalists and whistleblowers, and that people will no longer be able to blow the whistle on important things, abuses by government, and all of that is quite correct. But in their description, they could be talking about this man. They could be talking about Julian Assange, because who is he? He is a journalist and a publisher who is publishing material that is important to the public interest, provided to him by whistleblowers. So how is that any different? But even this is just 2 days ago, we get this rather bland reporting from the ABC. WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange will not be extradited to Sweden in suspected rape case. A Swedish court on Monday rejected a request from prosecutors for WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange to be detained in absentia over a 2010 rape allegation. Well, I haven't seen any editorials from the ABC saying that Julian must the rights of an Australian have to be protected. And in fact, actually, if you listen to this next bit from John Pilger, you can see in the question the hostility of the journalist towards Julian Assange. And I just wonder, after yesterday's events, whether they're just going to have second thoughts about this. So let's just listen to this next little segment.
Australian journalist Peter Grester is the founder of the Alliance for Journalists' Freedom. He himself, of course, was arrested in Egypt a few years ago. And he says Assange is not a journalist, writing that journalism demands more than simply acquiring confidential information and releasing it unfiltered onto the internet for punters to sort through. It comes with responsibility. Doesn't he have a point about that? Journalists actually filter the information. They tell the story.
No, he doesn't have any point at all. What Grester said is a disgrace, actually, and he's very much in the minority. I've been a journalist and a foreign correspondent and covered many wars and all the rest of it for a long time. Julian Assange is every bit as much a journalist as I am. What has changed is the digital revolution has allowed information to be much more widely available. And WikiLeaks is the first organization that has adapted to that and has adapted very, very successfully in what it's achieved. And Gresta takes none of that into consideration. The issue with Assange here really is the Australian government, especially during the time of an election campaign. If Julian Assange this was all happening to him, this illegal dragging him out of an embassy and then giving him 50 days for some bogus bail infringement charge, if this was all happening in China, the Australian government would be jumping up and down, or any other country that was deemed to be rather hostile to us, quote unquote. But there hasn't been a peep out of them, and I've had quite a bit to do with the Australian government's non-involvement, studied non-involvement in the Julian Assange case. I once listened to, at a meeting, to the Australian consul in London say rather boastfully that his only knowledge of the Assange case was from the media. And that really is the issue here. The Australian government, right from the point when the Gillard government tried to interest the Australian Federal Police in prosecuting WikiLeaks and had to be told by the AFP that it had committed no crime, right from that point in 2011 to the present day, the Australian government has been very much part of the problem, and it could be the solution. It's
Radio New Zealand interview with the chap from ABC reference this that occurred, I think, the day before or 2 days before, even though the Liberal journalist distanced himself, I noticed, from News Corp, which is Rupert Murdoch's news organisation. The police raid the home of prominent journalists who reported on secret spying program. Australian police raided the home of one of the country's prominent journalists Tuesday, raising questions about press freedom in that country and across the Western world. Journalist Annika Smethurst, the national politics editor at Sydney's Sunday Telegraph, was the target of the early morning raid. Police served a warrant at her home related to material she obtained and used in a story on April 29, 2018, about an Australian government plan to expand surveillance capabilities for the Australian Signals Directorate, ASD. In response to the raid, News Corp Australia, Smith's employer, decried the police actions as a dangerous act of intimidation. Quote, "What's gone on this morning sends a clear and dangerous signal to journalists and newsrooms across the world," the company said in a statement. "This will chill public interest reporting." And of course, News Corp has probably been the leading news organisation that's been the most hostile to Julian Assange, and now they're discovering what happens when you suppress press freedom in this way. New Zealand Bill of Rights Act 1990, and amongst other things, Section 14 is freedom of expression. Everyone has the right to freedom of expression, including the freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and opinions of any kind in any form. Now, we don't have in the Westminster system a constitution. We don't have the First Amendment. So this is all we've got. And I've noticed since, possibly before, but since the March 15 attacks in Christchurch, that nobody in the media or government has cited the Bill of Rights, certainly not this part. And I just did a quick search, and it's can't be illustrated any more clearly than this. This is put out by the New Zealand government. They say human rights and freedoms, human rights are the basic freedoms and rights we've been entitled to, no matter what our age, ethnicity, culture, religion, or sex. So the whole thing is, what do they talk about? Human rights protects people in New Zealand from discrimination. And unlawful discrimination is when you're treated unfairly or less favourably than any other person because of your age, colour, disability, employment status, ethical belief, etc. And then it goes through kind of the basic rights and freedoms, saying you can't discriminate and children can't be discriminated, all very well. New Zealand and international law, etc. So nowhere in here, in this government document, does it mention anything about freedom of speech. It doesn't mention anything. It doesn't mention this at all, which is equally important. And so we've had this attack on our freedom of expression. We have the Prime Minister going across and conferring with Emmanuel Macron, one of the leading globalists, on how to basically control the internet in their own interests. And nowhere in any of the talk of this is any citation of the Human Rights Act. Nothing about freedom of expression. That's left out of the dialogue. In fact, it's all based on a rendition of the Human Rights Act, which will reinforce all the social engineering that we're seeing in other areas. So discrimination against Muslims, discrimination against gays, against transsexuals, etc. And of course, I'm not in favour of any discrimination at all, but it's the emphasis and the de-emphasising of this aspect of the Human Rights Act. And now on top of that, we have this egregious attack on journalists and journalistic freedom in Australia, while Julian Assange is languishing in Belmarsh prison. That's the UK's Guantanamo Bay. He hasn't yet been extradited to the United States, and already the Australian government feels empowered to raid the offices of the ABC and to invade the home of a journalist who dared to leak information that was embarrassing to the Australian government. So I'm absolutely flabbergasted by people's inability to talk about this. They really don't see the writing on the wall, and the writing on the wall is not good. And I can only finish off really by harking back to Pastor Niemoller, and perhaps we need some form of paraphrasing of his famous words. I think we're living or transitioning into very dark days in both Australia and New Zealand, and of course elsewhere. So that's from me, Seymour Rocks, reporting from down under.